name is Tula. I was born in the Netherlands and then I moved to Canada at the age of 9. I am 23 years old now and super excited to be reading for you today. Wednesday, 10 March 1943. Dear Kitty, we had a short circuit last evening, and on top of that, the guns kept banging away all the time. I still haven't got over my fear of everything connected with shooting and planes, and I creep into Daddy's bed nearly every night for comfort. I know it's very childish, but you don't know what it's like. The AA guns roar so loudly that you can't hear yourself speak. Mrs. Van Daan, the fatalist, was nearly crying, and said in a very timid little voice, "Oh, it is so unpleasant. Oh, they are shooting so hard," by which she really means, "I am so frightened." It didn't seem nearly so bad by candlelight as in the dark. I was shivering just as if I had a temperature, and begged Daddy to light the candle again. He was relentless, the light remained off. Suddenly there was a burst of machine gun fire, and that is 10 times worse than guns. Mummy jumped out of bed and, to Pim's annoyance, lit the candle. When he complained, her answer was firm. After all, Anne's not exactly a veteran soldier, and that was the end of it. Have I already told you about Mrs. Van Daan's other fears? I don't think so. If I am to keep you informed of all that happens in the secret annex, you must know about this too. One night Mrs. Van Daan thought she heard burglars in the attic. She heard loud footsteps and was so frightened that she woke her husband. Just at that moment the burglars disappeared, and the only sounds that Mr. Van Daan could hear were the heartbeats of the frightened fatalist herself. "Oh, Petit," Mr. Van Daan's nickname. "They are sure to have taken the sausages and all our peas and beans. And Peter, I wonder if he's still safely in bed? They certainly won't have stolen Peter. Listen, don't worry and let me go to sleep." But nothing came of that. Mrs. Van Daan was far too nervous to sleep another wink. A few nights after that, the whole Van Daan family was woken by ghostly sounds. Peter went up to the attic with a torch, and a scamper. What do you think it was running away? A swarm of enormous rats. When we knew who the thieves were, we let Mushi sleep in the attic, and the uninvited guests didn't come back again, at least not during the night. Peter went up to the loft a couple of evenings ago to fetch some old newspapers. He had to hold the trapdoor firmly to get down the steps. He put his hand down without looking, and went tumbling down the ladder from the sudden shock and pain. Without knowing it, he had put his hand on a large rat, and it had bitten him hard. By the time he reached us, as white as a sheet and with his knees knocking, the blood had soaked through his pajamas. And no wonder. It's not very pleasant to stroke a large rat, and to get bitten into the bargain is really dreadful. Yours, Anne. Friday, 12 March 1943. Dear Kitty, may I introduce someone to you? Mama Frank, champion of youth. Extra butter for the young, the problems of modern youth. Mommy defends youth in everything, and after a certain amount of squabbling, she always gets her way. A bottle of preserved sole has gone bad. Gala dinner for Mushi and Bochi. You haven't met Bochi yet, although she was here before we went into hiding. She's the warehouse and office cat and keeps down the rats in the storerooms. Her odd political name requires an explanation. For some time the firm had 2 cats, one for the warehouse and one for the attic. Now it occasionally happened that the 2 cats met, and the result was always a terrible fight. The aggressor was always the warehouse cat, yet it was always the attic cat who managed to win, just like among nations. So the storehouse cat was named the German, or Bochi, and the attic cat the English, or Tommen. Tommy was got rid of later. We were all entertained by Bocho when we got downstairs. We've eaten so many kidney beans and haricot beans that I can't bear the sight of them anymore. The mere thought of them makes me feel quite sick. Bread is no longer served in the evenings now. Daddy has just said that he doesn't feel in a good mood. His eyes look so sad again, poor soul. I can't drag myself away from a book called The Knock at the Door by Ina Boudier-Bucker. The story of the family is exceptionally well written. Apart from that, it is about war, writers, the emancipation of women, and quite honestly, I'm not awfully interested. Horrible air raids on Germany. Mr. Van Daan is in a bad mood. The cause, cigarette shortage. Discussions over the question of whether we should or should not use our canned vegetables ended in our favor. I can't get into a single pair of shoes anymore, except ski boots, which are not much used about the house. A pair of Rush sandals costing 650 florins lasted me just 1 week, after which they were out of action. Perhaps Meeple scrounged something under the counter. I must cut Daddy's hair. Bim maintains that he will never have an other barber after the war, as I do the job so well. If only I didn't snip his ears so often. Yours, Anne. Thursday, 18 March, 1943. Dear Kitty, Turkey is in the war. Great excitement. Waiting in suspense for the news. Yours, Anne. Friday, 19 March, 1943. Dear Kitty, an hour later, joy was followed by disappointment. Turkey is not in the war yet. It was only a cabinet minister talking about them soon giving up their neutrality. A newspaper in the Dom was crying, Turkey on England's side. The newspapers were torn out of his hands. This is how the joyful news reached us too. 500 and 1,000 guilder notes have been declared no longer valid. It is a trap for black marketeers and such like. But even more for people who have got other kinds of black money, and for people in hiding. If you wish to hand in 1,000 guilder note, you must be able to declare and prove exactly how you got it. They must still be used to pay taxes, but only until next week. Dessel has received an old-fashioned foot-operated dentist's drill. I expect he'll soon give me a thorough check-over. The Führer aller Germanen has been talking to wounded soldiers. Listening in to it was pitiful. Question and answer went something like this. My name is Heinrich Scheppo. Wounded where? Near Stalingrad. What kind of wound? 2 feet frozen off and a broken joint in the left arm. This is exactly what the frightful puppet show on the radio was like. The wounded seemed to be proud of their wounds, the more the better. One of them felt so moved at being able to shake hands with the Führer, that is, if he still had a hand, that he could hardly get the words out of his mouth. Yours, Anne. Thursday, 25 March, 1943. Dear Kitty, yesterday Mommy, Daddy, Margot, and I were sitting pleasantly together when suddenly Peter came in and whispered something in Daddy's ear. I heard something about a barrel fallen over in the warehouse and someone fumbling about the door. Margot heard it too, but when Daddy and Peter went off immediately, she tried to calm me down a bit, because I was naturally as white as a sheet and very jittery. The 3 of us waited in suspense. A minute or 2 later, Mrs. Van Daan came upstairs. She'd been listening to the wireless in the private office. She told us that Pim had asked her to turn off the wireless and go softly upstairs. But you know what that's like. If you want to be extra quiet, then each step of the old stairs creaks twice as loudly. 5 minutes later, Bim and Peter appeared again, white to the roots of their hair, and told us their experiences. They had hidden themselves under the stairs and waited, with no result at first. But suddenly, yes, I must tell you, they heard 2 loud bumps, just as if 2 doors were banged here in the house. Bim was upstairs in 1 leap. Peter warned Dessel first, who finally landed upstairs with a lot of fuss and noise. Then we all went up in his stockinged feet to the Van Daans on the next floor. Mr. Van Daan had a bad cold and had already gone to bed, so we all drew up closely around his bed and whispered our suspicions to him. Each time Mr. Van Daan coughed loudly, Mrs. Van Daan and I were so scared that we thought we were going to have a fit. That went on until one of us got the bright idea of giving him some codeine, which soothed the cough at once. Again we waited and waited, but we heard no more, and finally we all came to the conclusion that the thieves had taken to their heels when they heard footsteps in the house, which was otherwise so silent. Now it was unfortunate that the wireless downstairs was still turned to England, and that the chairs were neatly arranged around it. If the door had been forced and the air raid wardens had noticed and warned the police, then the results might have been very unpleasant. So Mr. Van Daan got up and put on his coat and hat and followed Daddy cautiously downstairs. Peter took up the rear, armed with a large hammer in case of emergencies. The ladies upstairs, including Margot and me, waited in suspense until the gentleman reappeared 5 minutes later and told us that all was quiet in the house. We arranged that we would not draw any water or pull the plug in the lavatory. But as the excitement had affected most of our tummies, you can imagine what the atmosphere was like when we had each paid a visit in succession. When something like that happens, heaps of other things seem to come at the same time, as now. Number 1 was that the clock at the Westertoren, which I always find so reassuring, did not strike. Number 2 was that Mr. Vosse, having left earlier than usual the previous evening, we didn't know definitely whether Ellie had been able to get hold of the key and had perhaps forgotten to shut the door. It was still evening, and we were still in a state of uncertainty, although we certainly did feel a bit reassured by the fact that from about 8 o'clock, when the burglar had alarmed the house, until 10:30, we had not heard a sound. On further reflection, it also seemed very unlikely to us that a thief would have forced open a door so early in the evening, while there were still people about in the streets. Moreover, one of us got the idea that it was possible that the caretaker of the warehouse next door was still at work since, in the excitement, and with the thin walls, one can easily make a mistake, and what's more, one's imagination can play a big part at such critical moments. So we all went to bed, but none of us could get to sleep. Daddy, as well as Mummy and Mr. Dissel, were awake, and without much exaggeration, I can say that I hardly slept a wink. This morning, the men went downstairs to see whether the outside door was still shut, and everything turned out to be quite safe. We gave everyone a detailed description of the nerve-wracking event. They all made fun of it, but it is easy to laugh at such things afterwards. Ellie was the only one who took us seriously. Yours, Anne. Saturday, 27 March, 1943. Dear Kitty, we have finished our shorthand course. Now we are beginning to practice speed. Aren't we getting clever? I must tell you more about my time-killing subjects. I call them such because we have got nothing else to do but make the days go by as quickly as possible, so that the end of our time here comes more quickly. I am mad on mythology, and especially the gods of Greece and Rome. They think here that it is just a passing craze. They've never heard of an adolescent kid of my age being interested in mythology. Well then, I shall be the first. Mr. Van Daan has a cold, or rather he has a little tickle in his throat. He makes a tremendous fuss about it, gargling with chamomile tea, painting his throat with tincture of myrrh, rubbing eucalyptus all over his chest, nose, teeth, and tongue, and then getting into an evil mood on top of it all. Lauter, one of the German big shots, has made a speech. All Jews must be out of the German-occupied countries before July 1st. Between April 1st and May 1st, the province of Utrecht must be cleaned out, as if the Jews were cockroaches. Between May 1st and June 1st, the provinces of North and South Holland. These wretched people are sent to filthy slaughterhouses like a herd of sick, neglected cattle. But I won't talk about it. I only get nightmares from such thoughts. One good little piece of news is that the German Department of the Labor Exchange has been set on fire by saboteurs. A few days after, the registrar's office went to the same way. Men in German police uniforms gagged the guards and managed to destroy important papers. Yours, Anne. Thursday, 1st of April, 1943. Dear Kitty, I am really not April fooling, see the date, but the opposite. Today I can easily quote the saying, misfortunes never come singly. To begin with, Mr. Koophuis, the one who always cheers us up, has had hemorrhage of the stomach and has got to stay in bed for at least 3 weeks. Secondly, Ellie has flu. Thirdly, Mr. Vossen is going to the hospital next week. He has probably got an abdominal ulcer. And fourthly, some important business conferences, the main points of which Daddy has discussed in detail with Mr. Koophuis, were due to be held, but now there isn't time to explain everything thoroughly to Mr. Kraler. The gentleman who had been expected duly arrived. Even before they came, Daddy was trembling with anxiety as to how the talks would go. If only I could be there, if only I was downstairs, he cried. Why don't you go and lie with one ear pressed against the floor? Then you'll be able to hear everything. Daddy's face cleared, and at 10:30 yesterday morning, Margot and Bim, 2 ears are better than one, took up their positions on the floor. The talks were not finished in the morning, but by the afternoon Daddy was not in a fit state to continue the listening campaign. He was half paralyzed from remaining in so unusual and uncomfortable a position. I took his place at 2:30, as soon as we heard voices in the passage. Margot kept me company. The talk at times was so long-winded and boring that quite suddenly I fell asleep on the cold, hard linoleum floor. Margot did not dare to touch me for fear they might hear us, and talking was out of the question. I slept for a good half hour and then woke up with a shock, having forgotten every word of the important discussions. Luckily, Margot had paid more attention. Yours, Anne.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm 28 years old and Anishinaabe from Treaty 1 territory. And I would like to acknowledge the generous hosts of the land I now live on, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. I love making videos, and I'm very excited to bring Anne Frank's story into your home. Friday, April 2nd, 1943. Dearest Kitty, oh my, another item has been added to my list of sins. Last night, was lying in bed, waiting for Father to tuck me in and say my prayers with me, when Mother came into the room, sat on my bed, and asked very gently, Anne, Daddy isn't ready. How about if I listen to your prayers tonight? No, Mumsy, I replied. Mother got up, stood beside my bed for a moment, and then slowly walked toward the door. Suddenly she turned, her face contorted with pain, and said, I don't want to be angry with you. I can't make you love me. A few tears slid down her cheeks as she went out the door. I lay still, thinking how mean it was of me to reject her so cruelly. But I also knew that I was incapable of answering her any other way. I can't be a hypocrite and pray with her when I don't feel like it. It just doesn't work that way. I felt sorry for Mother. Very, very sorry. Because for the first time in my life, I noticed she wasn't indifferent to my coldness. I saw the sorrow in her face when she talked about not being able to make me love her. It's hard to tell the truth, and yet the truth is that she's the one who rejected me. She's the one whose tactless comments and cruel jokes about matters I don't think are funny have made me insensitive to any sign of love on her part. Just as my heart sinks every time I hear her harsh words, that's how her heart sank when she realized there was no more love between us. She cried half the night and didn't get any sleep. Father has avoided looking at me, and if his eyes do happen to cross mine, I can read his unspoken words. How can you be so unkind? How dare you make your mother so sad? Everyone expects me to apologize, but this is not something I can apologize for, because I told the truth, and sooner or later Mother was bound to find out anyway. I seem to be indifferent to Mother's tears and Father's glances, and I am, because both of them are now feeling what I've always felt. I can only feel sorry for Mother, who will have to figure out what her attitude should be all by herself. For my part, I will continue to remain silent and aloof, and I don't intend to shrink from the truth, because the longer it's postponed, the harder it will be for them to accept it when they do hear it. Yours, Anne. Tuesday, April 27th, 1943. Dearest Kitty, the house is still trembling from the after effects of the quarrels. Everyone is mad at everyone else. Mother and I, Mr. Van Dan and Father, Mother and Mrs. Van D. Terrific atmosphere, don't you think? Once again, Anne's usual list of shortcomings has been extensively aired. Our German visitors were back last Saturday. They stayed until 6. We all sat upstairs, not daring to move an inch. There's no one else working in the building or in the neighborhood. You can hear every single step in the private office. I've got ants in my pants again from having to sit still so long. Mr. Vakasjil has been hospitalized, but Mr. Kleeman's back at the office. His stomach stopped bleeding sooner than it normally does. He told us that the county clerk's office took an extra beating because the firemen flooded the entire building instead of just putting out the fire. That does my heart good. The Carlton Hotel has been destroyed. 2 British planes loaded with firebombs landed on top of the German officers' club. The entire corner of Vigelstraat and Singel has gone up in flames. The number of airstrikes on German cities is increasing daily. We haven't had a good night's rest in ages, and I have bags under my eyes from lack of sleep. Our food is terrible. Breakfast consists of plain unbuttered bread and my ersatz coffee. For the last 2 weeks, lunch has been either spinach or cooked lettuce with huge potatoes that have a rotten Swedish taste. If you're trying to diet, the annex is the place to be. Upstairs, they complain bitterly, but we don't think it's such a tragedy. All the Dutch men who either fought or were mobilized in 1940 have been called up to work in prisoner of war camps. I bet they're taking this precaution because of the invasion. Yours, Anne. Saturday, May 1st, 1943. Dearest Kitty, yesterday was Dussel's birthday. At first he acted as if he didn't want to celebrate it, but when Miep arrived with a large shopping bag overflowing with gifts, he was as excited as a little kid. His darling Lotja has sent him eggs, butter, cookies, lemonade, bread, cognac, spice cake, flowers, oranges, chocolate, books, and writing paper. He piled his presents on a table and displayed them for no fewer than 3 days, the silly old goat. You mustn't get the idea that he's starving. We found bread, cheese, jam, and eggs in his cupboard. It's absolutely disgraceful that Dussel, whom we've treated with such kindness and whom we took in to save from destruction, should stuff himself behind our backs and not give us anything. After all, we've shared all we had with him. But what's worse, in our opinion, is that he's so stingy with respect to Mr. Kleeman, Mr. Vokasjil, and Bep. He doesn't give them a thing. In Dussel's view, the oranges that Kleeman so badly needs for his sick stomach will benefit his own stomach even more. Tonight the guns have been banging away so much that I've already had to gather up my belongings 4 times. Today I packed a suitcase with the stuff I'd need in case we had to flee, but as Mother correctly noted, where would you go? All of Holland is being punished for the workers' strikes. Martial law has been declared and everyone is going to get 1 less butter coupon. What naughty children. I washed Mother's hair this evening, which is no easy task these days. We have to use a sticky liquid cleanser because there's no more shampoo. Besides that, Mom's had a hard time combing her hair because the family comb has only 10 teeth left. Yours, Anne. Sunday, May 2nd, 1943. When I think about our lives here, I usually come to the conclusion that we live in a paradise compared to the Jews who aren't in hiding. All the same, later on, when everything has returned to normal, I'll probably wonder how we, who always lived in such comfortable circumstances, could have sunk so low. With respect to manners, I mean. For example, the same oilcloth has covered the dining table ever since we've been here. After so much use, it's hardly what you'd call spotless. I do my best to clean it, but since the dishcloth was also purchased before we went into hiding and consists of more holes than cloth, it's a thankless task. The Van Dans have been sleeping all winter long on the same flannel sheet, which can't be washed because detergent is rationed and in short supply. Besides, it's of such poor quality that it's practically useless. Father is walking around in frayed trousers, and his tie is also showing signs of wear and tear. Mom's corset snapped today and is beyond repair, while Margot is wearing a bra that's 2 sizes too small. Mother and Margot have shared the same 3 undershorts the entire winter, and mine are so small they don't even cover my stomach. These are all things that can be overcome, but I sometimes wonder how can we, whose every possession, from my underpants to Father's shaving brush, is so old and worn, ever hope to regain the position we had before the war? Sunday, May 2nd, 1943. The attitude of the annex residents towards the war. Mr. Van Daan, in the opinion of us all, this revered gentleman has great insight into politics. Nevertheless, he predicts we'll have to stay here until the end of 43. That's a very long time, and yet it's possible to hold out until then. But who can assure us that this war, which has caused nothing but pain and sorrow, will then be over, and that nothing will have happened to us and our helpers long before that time? No one. That's why each and every day is filled with tension. Expectation and hope generate tension, as does fear. For example, when we hear a noise inside or outside the house, when the guns go off, or when we read new proclamations in the paper, since we're afraid our helpers might be forced to go into hiding themselves sometimes. These days, everyone is talking about having to hide. We don't know how many people are actually in hiding, of course. The number is relatively small compared to the general population. But later on, we'll no doubt be astonished at how many good people in Holland were willing to take Jews and Christians, with or without money, into their homes. There's also an unbelievable number of people with false identity papers. Mrs. Van Daan, when this beautiful damsel, by her own account, heard that it was getting easier these days to obtain false IDs, she immediately proposed that we each have one made, as if there were nothing to it, as if Father and Mr. Van Daan were made of money. Mrs. Van Daan is always saying the most ridiculous things, and her putty is often exasperated. But that's not surprising, because one day Curly announces, "When this is all over, I'm going to have myself baptized. And the next, as long as I can remember, I've wanted to go to Jerusalem. I only feel at home with other Jews." Pim is a big optimist, but he's always had his reasons. Mr. Dussel makes up everything as he goes along, and anyone wishing to contradict His Majesty had better think twice. In Alfred Dussel's home, his word is law, but that doesn't suit Anne Frank in the least. What the other members of the Annex family think about the war doesn't matter. When it comes to politics, these four are the only ones who count. Actually, only two of them do, but Madame Van Daan and Dussel include themselves as well. Tuesday, May 18th, 1943. Dearest Kit, I recently witnessed a fierce dogfight between German and English pilots. Unfortunately, a couple of Allied airmen had to jump out of their burning plane. Our milkman, who lives in Halfweg, saw 4 Canadians sit along the side of the road, and one of them spoke fluent Dutch. He asked the milkman if he had a light for his cigarette, and then told him the crew had consisted of 6 men. The pilot had burned to death, and the 5th crew member had hidden himself somewhere. The German security police came to pick up the 4 remaining men, none of which were injured. After parachuting out of a flaming plane, how can anyone have such presence of mind? Although it's undeniably hot, we have to light a fire every other day to burn our vegetable peelings and garbage. We can't throw anything into trash cans because the warehouse employees might see it. One small act of carelessness and we're done for. All college students are being asked to sign an official statement to the effect that they sympathize with the Germans and approve of the new order. 80% have decided to obey the dictates of their conscience, but the penalty will be severe. Any student refusing to sign will be sent to a German labor camp. What's to become of the youth of our country if they've all got to do hard labor in Germany? Last night the guns were making so much noise that Mother shut the window. I was in Pim's bed. Suddenly, right above our heads, we heard Mrs. Van D leap up as if she's been bitten by moose-she. This was followed by a loud boom, which sounded as if a firebomb had landed beside my bed. "Lights! Lights!" I screamed. Pim switched on the lamp. I expected the room to burst into flames any minute. Nothing happened. We all rushed upstairs to see what was going on. Mr. and Mrs. Van D had seen a red glow through the open window, and he thought there was a fire nearby, while she was certain our house was ablaze. Mrs. Van D was already standing beside her bed with her knees knocking when the boom came. Dussel stayed upstairs to smoke a cigarette, and we crawled back into bed. Less than 15 minutes later, the shooting started again. Mrs. Van D sprang out of bed and went downstairs to Dussel's room to seek the comfort she was unable to find with her spouse. Dussel welcomed her with the words, "Come into my bed, my child." We burst into peals of laughter, and the roar of the guns bothered us no more. Our fears had all been swept away. Yours, Anne. Sunday, June 13th, 1943. Dearest Kitty, the poem Father composed for my birthday is too nice to keep to myself. Since Pim writes his verses only in German, Margot volunteered to translate it into Dutch. See for yourself whether Margot hasn't done herself proud. It begins with the usual summary of the year's events and then continues, as youngest amongst us, but small no more. Your life can be trying, for we have the chore of becoming your teachers, a terrible bore. We've got experience. Take it from me. We've done this all before, you see. We know the ropes, we know the same. Since time immemorial, always the same. One's own shortcomings are nothing but fluff, but everyone else's are heavier stuff. Fault-finding comes easy when this is our plight, but it's hard for your parents, try as they might, to treat you with fairness and kindness as well. Nitpicking's a habit that's hard to dispel. Men, you're living with old folks. All you can do is put up with their nagging. It's hard, but it's true. The pill may be bitter, but down it must go, for it's meant to keep the peace, you know. This many months here have not been in vain, since wasting time knows against your brain. You read and study nearly all the day, determined to chase the boredom away. The more difficult question, much harder to bear, is, what on earth do I have to wear? I've got no more panties. My clothes are too tight. My shirt is a loincloth. I'm really a sight. To put on my shoes, I must off my toes. Oh dear, I'm plagued with so many woes. Margot had trouble getting to the part about food to rhyme, so I'm leaving it out. But aside from that, don't you think it's a good poem? For the rest, I've been thoroughly spoiled and have received a number of lovely presents, including a big book on my favorite subject, Greek and Roman mythology. Nor can I complain about the lack of candy. Everyone had dipped into their last reserves. As the Benjamin of the Annex, I got more than I deserve. Yours, Anne. Tuesday, June 15th, 1943. Dearest Kitty, heaps of things have happened, but I often think I'm boring you with my dreary chit-chat and that. You'd just as soon have fewer letters, so I'll keep the news brief. Mr. Vakuschil wasn't operated on for his ulcer after all. Once the doctors had him on the operating table and opened him up, they saw that he had cancer. It was in such an advanced stage that the operation was pointless. So they stitched him up again, kept him in the hospital for 3 weeks, fed him well, and sent him back home. But they made an unforgivable error. They told the poor man exactly what was in store for him. He can't work anymore, and he's just sitting at home surrounded by his 8 children, brooding about his approaching death. I feel very sorry for him and hate not being able to go out. Otherwise, I'd visit him as often as I could and help take his mind off matters. Now the good man can no longer let us know what's being said and done in the warehouse, which is a disaster for us. Mr. Vakuschil was our greatest source of help and support when it came to safety measures. We miss him very much. Next month, it's our turn to hand over our radio to the authorities. Mr. Kleeman had a small set hidden in his home that he's giving us to replace our beautiful cabinet radio. It's a pity we have to turn in our big Philips, but when you're in hiding, you can't afford to bring the authorities down on your heads. Of course, we'll put the baby radio upstairs. What's a clandestine radio when there are already clandestine Jews and clandestine money? All over the country, people are trying to get hold of an old radio that they can hand over instead of their morale booster. It's true, as the reports from outside grow worse and worse, the radio, with its wondrous voice, helps us not to lose heart and to keep telling ourselves, cheer up, keep your spirits high, things are bound to get better. Yours, Anne.
Hi, my name is Leary. I'm an 18-year-old. I live on Coast Salish lands in Richmond. I'm very excited to be bringing this story. I love reading and performing, and I'm very passionate about Anne Frank's story, so I'm very excited to share it with you all. Sunday, July 11th, 1943. Dear Kitty, to get back to the subject of child rearing for the upteenth time, let me tell you that I'm doing my best to be helpful, friendly, and kind, and to do all I can to keep the rain of rebukes down to a light drizzle. It's not easy trying to behave like a model child with people you can't stand, especially when you don't mean a word of it. But I can see that a little hypocrisy gets me a lot further than my old method of saying exactly what I think, even though no one ever asks my opinions or cares one way or another. Of course, I often forget my role and find it impossible to curb my anger when they're unfair, so that they spend the next month saying I'm the most impertinent girl in the world. Don't you think I'm to be pitied sometimes? It's a good thing I'm not the grouchy type, because then I might become sour and bad-tempered. I can usually see the humorous side of their scoldings, but it's easier when somebody else is being raked over the coals. Further, I've decided, after a great deal of thought, to drop the shorthand. First, so that I have time for my other subjects, and second, because of my eyes. That's a sad story. I've become very nearsighted and should have had glasses ages ago. Ugh, won't I look like a dope? But as you know, people in hiding can't. Yesterday, all anyone here could talk about was Anne's eyes because Mother had suggested I go to the ophthalmologist with Mrs. Kleiman. Just hearing this made my knees weak, since it's no small matter. Going outside. Just think of it. Walking down the street. I can't imagine it. I was petrified at first, and then glad. But it's not as simple as all that. The various authorities who had to approve such a step were unable to reach a quick decision. They first had to carefully weigh all the difficulties and risks, though Meep was ready to set off immediately with me in tow. In the meantime, I'd taken my greatcoat from the closet, but it was so small it looked as if it might have belonged to my little sister. We lowered the hem, but I still couldn't button it. I'm really curious to see what they decide, only I don't think they'll ever work out a plan, because the British have landed in Sicily and Father's all set for a quick finish. Bep's been giving Margot and me a lot of office work to do. It makes us both feel important, and it's a big help to her. Anyone can file letters and make entries in a sales book, but we do it with remarkable accuracy. Meep has so much to carry she looks like a pack mule. She goes forth nearly every day to scrounge up vegetables and then bicycles back with her purchases in large shopping bags. She's also the one who brings 5 library books with her every Saturday. We long for Saturdays because that means books. We're like a bunch of little kids with a present. Ordinary people don't know how much books can mean to someone who's cooped up. Our only diversions are reading, studying, and listening to the radio. Yours, Anne. Tuesday, July 13th, 1943. The best little table. Yesterday afternoon, Father gave me permission to ask Mr. Dussel whether he would please be so good as to allow me, see how polite I am, to use the table in our room 2 afternoons a week, from 4 to 5:30. I already sit there every day from 2:30 to 4 while Dussel takes a nap, but the rest of the time the room and the table are off limits to me. It's impossible to study next door in the afternoon because there's too much going on. Besides, Father sometimes likes to sit at the desk during the afternoon. So it seemed like a reasonable request, and I asked Dussel very politely. What do you think the learned gentleman's reply was? No. Just plain no. I was incensed and wasn't about to let myself be put off like that. I asked him the reason for his no, but this didn't get me anywhere. The gist of his reply was, I have to study too, you know, and if I can't do that in the afternoons, I won't be able to fit it in at all. I have to finish the task I've set for myself. Otherwise, there's no point in starting. Besides, you aren't serious about your studies. Mythology. What kind of work is that? Reading and knitting don't count either. I use that table and I'm not going to give it up. I replied, Mr. Dussel, I do take my work seriously. I can't study next door in the afternoons, and I would appreciate if you would reconsider my request. Having said these words, the insulted Anne turned around and pretended the learned doctor wasn't there. I was seething with rage and felt that Dussel had been incredibly rude, which he certainly had been, and that I'd been very polite. That evening, when I managed to get hold of Pym, I told him what had happened and we discussed what my next step should be. Because I had no intention of giving up and preferred to deal with the matter myself, Pym gave me a rough idea of how to approach Dussel, but cautioned me to wait until the next day, since I was in such a flap. I ignored this last piece of advice and waited for Dussel after the dishes had been done. Pym was sitting next door, and that had been a calming effect. I began, Mr. Dussel, you seem to believe further discussion of this matter is pointless, but I beg you to reconsider. Dussel gave me his most charming smile and said, I'm always prepared to discuss the matter, even though it's already been settled. I went on talking, despite Dussel's repeated interruptions. When you first came here, I said, we agreed that the room was to be shared by the two of us, and if we were to divide it fairly, you'd have the entire morning and I'd have the entire afternoon. I'm not asking for that much, but 2 afternoons a week does seem reasonable to me. Dussel leapt out of his chair as if he'd sat on a pin. You have no business talking about your rights to the room. Where am I supposed to go? Maybe I should ask Mr. Van Daan to build me a cubbyhole in the attic. You're not the only one who can't find a quiet place to work. You're always looking for a fight. If your sister Margot, who had more right to workspaces than you do, had come to me with the same request, I'd never even have thought of refusing. But you... And once again he brought up the business about the mythology and the knitting, and once again Anne was insulted. However, I showed no sign of it and let Dussel finish. But no, it's impossible to talk to you. You're shamefully self-centered. No one else matters as long as you get your way. I've never seen such a child. But after all is said and done, I'll be obliged to let you have your way, since I don't want people saying later on that Anne Frank failed her exam because Mr. Dussel refused to relinquish his table. He went on and on until there was such a deluge of words I could hardly keep up. For one fleeting moment I thought, him and his lies, I'll smack his ugly mug so hard he'll go bouncing off the wall. But the next moment I thought, calm down, he's not worth getting so upset about. At long last, Mr. Dussel's fury was spent, and he left the room with an expression of triumph mixed with wrath, his coat pockets bulging with food. I went running over to Father and recounted the entire story, or at least those parts he hadn't been able to follow himself. Pym decided to talk to Dussel that very same evening, and they spoke for more than half an hour. They first discussed whether Anne should be allowed to use the table, yes or no. Father said that he and Dussel had dealt with the subject once before, at which time he'd professed to agree with Dussel because he didn't want to contradict the elder in front of the younger, but that, even then, he hadn't thought it was fair. Dussel felt I had no right to talk as if he were an intruder laying claim to everything in sight, but Father protested strongly, since he himself had heard me say nothing of the kind. And so the conversation went back and forth, with Father defending my selfishness and my busy work, and Dussel grumbling the whole time. Dussel finally had to give in, and I was granted the opportunity to work without interruption 2 afternoons a week. Dussel looked very sullen, didn't speak to me for 2 days, and made sure he occupied the table from 5 to 5:30. All very childish, of course. Anyone who's so petty and pedantic at the age of 54 was born that way and is never going to change. Yours, Anne. Friday, July 16th, 1943. Dearest Kitty, there's been another break-in, but this time a real one. Peter went downstairs to the warehouse this morning at 7, as usual, and noticed at once that both the warehouse doors and the street door were open. He immediately reported this to Pym, who went to the private office, turned the radio to a German station, and locked the door. Then they both went back upstairs. In such cases, our orders are not to wash ourselves or run any water, to be quiet, to be dressed by 8, and not to go to the bathroom. And as usual, we followed these to the letter. We were all glad we'd slept so well and hadn't heard anything. For a while, we were indignant because no one from the office came upstairs the entire morning. Mr. Kleiman left us on tenterhooks until 11:30. He said that the burglars had forced the outside door and the warehouse door with a crowbar, but when they didn't find anything worth stealing, they tried their luck on the next floor. They stole 2 cash boxes containing 40 guilders, blank checkbooks, and worst of all, coupons for 330 pounds of sugar, our entire allotment. It won't be easy to wrangle new ones. Mr. Kugler thinks this burglar belongs to the same gang as the one who made an unsuccessful attempt 6 weeks ago to open all three doors, the warehouse door and the two outside doors. The burglary caused another stir, but the annex seems to thrive on excitement. Naturally, we were glad the cash register and the typewriters had been safely tucked away in our clothes closet. Yours, Anne. P.S. Landing in Sicily. Another step closer to the Monday, July 19th, 1943. Dearest Kitty, North Amsterdam was very heavily bombed on Sunday. There was apparently a great deal of destruction. Entire streets are in ruins, and it will take a while for them to dig out all the bodies. So far, there have been 200 dead and countless wounded. The hospitals are bursting at the seams. We've been told of children searching forlornly in the smoldering ruins for their dead parents. It still makes me shiver to think of the dull, distant drone that signified the approaching destruction. Friday, July 23rd, 1943. Bep is currently able to get hold of notebooks, especially journals and ledgers, useful for my bookkeeping sister. Other kinds are for sale as well, but don't ask what they're like or how long they'll last. At the moment, they're all labeled, "No coupons needed." Like everything else you can purchase without ration stamps, they're totally worthless. They consist of 12 sheets of gray one paper with narrow lines that slant across the page. Margot is thinking about taking a course in calligraphy. I advised her to go ahead and do it. Mother won't let me because of my eyes, but I think that's silly. Whether I do that or something else, it all comes down to the same thing. Since you've never been through a war, Kitty, and since you know very little about life in hiding, in spite of my letters, let me tell you, just for fun, what we each want to do first when we're able to go outside again. Margot and Mr. Van Daan wish, above all else, to have a hot bath filled to the brim, which they can lie in for more than half an hour. Mrs. Van Daan would like a cake. Dessel can think of nothing but seeing his Charlotte, and Mother is dying for a cup of real coffee. Father would like to visit Mr. Vushkyle. Peter would go downtown. And as for me, I'd be so overjoyed I wouldn't know where to begin. Most of all, I long to have a home of our own, to be able to move around freely and have someone help me with my homework again at last. In other words, to go back to school. Bep has offered to get us some fruit at so-called bargain prices. Grapes, 2.5 guilders a pound. Gooseberries, 70 cents a pound. One peach, 50 cents. Melons, 75 cents a pound. No wonder the papers write every evening in big, fat letters, "Keep prices down!" Monday, July 26th, 1943. Dear Kitty, yesterday was a very tumultuous day, and we're still all wound up. Actually, you may wonder if there's ever a day that passes without some kind of excitement. The first warning siren went off in the morning, while we were at breakfast, but we paid no attention, because it only meant that the planes were crossing the coast. I had a terrible headache, so I lay down for half an hour after breakfast, and then went to the office at around 2. At 2:30, Margot had finished her office work and was just gathering her things together when the sirens began wailing again. So she and I trooped back upstairs. None too soon, it seems, for less than 5 minutes later the guns were booming so loudly that we went and stood in the hall. The house shook and the bombs kept falling. I was clutching my escape bag, more because I wanted to have something to hold on to than because I wanted to run away. I know we can't leave here, but if we had to, being seen on the streets would be just as dangerous as getting caught in an air raid. After half an hour, the drone of engines faded and the house began to hum with activity again. Peter emerged from his lookout post in the front attic. Dussel remained in the front office. Mrs. Van D felt safest in the private office. Mr. Van Daan had been watching from the loft, and those of us on the landing spread out to watch the columns of smoke rising from the harbor. Before long, the smell of fires was everywhere, and outside it looked as if the city were enveloped in a thick fog. A big fire like that is not a pleasant sight, but fortunately for us, it was all over, and we went back to our various chores. Just as we were starting dinner, another air raid alarm. The food was good, but I lost my appetite the moment I heard the siren. Nothing happened, however, and 45 minutes later, the all clear was sounded. After the dishes had been washed, another air raid warning, gunfire, and swarms of planes. Oh gosh, twice in one day, we thought. That's twice in one day. That's twice too many. Little good that did us, because once again the bombs rained down, this time on the others of the city. According to British reports, Schiphol Airport was bombed. The planes dived and climbed. The air was abuzz with the drone of engines. It was very scary, and the whole time I kept thinking, here it comes. This is it. I can assure you that when I went to bed at 9, my legs were still shaking. At the stroke of midnight, I woke up again. More planes! Bessel was undressing, but I took no notice and leapt up wide awake at the sound of the first shot. I stayed in Father's bed until 1, in my own bed until 1:30, and went back in Father's bed at 2. But the planes kept on coming. At last they stopped firing, and I was able to go back home again. I finally fell asleep at 2:30. 7 o'clock, I woke up with a start and sat up in bed. Mr. Van Daan was with Father. My first thought was burglars. Everything, I heard Mr. Van Daan say, and I thought everything had been stolen. But no, this time it was wonderful news, the best we've had in months, maybe even since the war began. Mussolini had resigned, and the King of Italy had taken over the government. We jumped for joy. After the awful events of yesterday, finally something good happens and brings us hope. Hope for an end to the war, hope for peace. Mr. Kugler dropped by and told us that Fokker Aircraft Factory had been hit hard. Meanwhile, there was another air raid alarm this morning, with planes flying over, and another warning siren. I've had it up to here with alarms. I've hardly slept, and the last thing I want to do is work. But now the suspense about Italy and the hope that the war will be over by the end of the year is keeping us awake. Yours, Anne.
We'll see you next time as we continue reading Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank. Thanks for joining.